Okay, yeah. During the field work in Mistissini, in the summertime, I still had my colleagues from the McGill Cree project and other people still at McGill, one of whom was a linguist, Marguerite Mackenzie, who had been doing research with whatever Crees happened to be in Montreal at the time when she was at McGill, including a man named Philip Awashish, who became one of the important leaders in the fight against the James Bay Project. So anyway, Marguerite showed up to do field work one summer in the summer after I came out of the bush. And so we got together, and eventually we got married down the line. But that's and linguistics, I should say, has always, you know, through reading of particularly Levi-Strauss's understandings of sort of binary oppositions within how linguists have broken down the phonemes and that into these distinctive difference that makes the difference. That kind of, you know, it seemed to me that while linguistics presents a model of human behavior that works in other aspects, it's an aspect of culture and that sort of thing. But linguists have been far more successful than other social scientists in coming up with scientific-like rules of that. And it's interesting that these rules are not necessarily conscious to the speaker. And so all of that very much influenced me. And so I always turn to linguistics often for ideas about how to solve a problem of understanding. And that the relationship of consciousness to behavior, you know, the degree to which people are acting on the basis of uncontemplated, unthought about ways of acting. Whereas, you know, as I say, my interest in religion and ideology is on the other extreme, where people have formulated conscious ideas and rules and that, often explaining why they behave the way they do. So, so anyway, that, you know, the fact that I married a linguist is probably partly interesting. Then, say 1971, the James Bay Project was announced. It turned out I was already working on a paper. One of the important things that I noticed was, first of all, this hunting territory system, how well it seemed to work to distribute people well over the land, to make sure everybody had adequate resources in the winter and that sort of thing. It seemed to be, you know, the literature at the time was focused on its origins. Was it a result of the fur trade? That seemed to me an irrelevant question, because however it started, it had never been a Hudson's Bay enterprise or proposal or imposed on the Cree by the Hudson Bay Company. It was something that, if it had a foreign origin, had become normalized as part of Cree culture. And that's what, and so I particularly focused, or one of my bits of research was on that. And it turned out to be extremely important in the court case, that way in not so much in the court case, I should say. I think it probably showed up in the agreement and later on, where the Crees' ability to manage their land through the traditional hunting territory system was written into the James Bay Agreement and subsequently became very important. So, but anyway, I came across a map of Frank Speck, and I obviously been reading Speck all the time, and was alternately annoyed by him and delighted by him. Anyway, this map that he did on hunting territory, which didn't have a very auspicious beginning, it was not collected at Mistissini. It was collected at Lac Saint-Jean, Point Bleu. I didn't know how many hunters, my history of the fur trade, people used to go to Rupert House on the canoe brigades, those who were the paddlers and obviously they could buy things at a cheaper cost. Then when the railway was built through central Quebec, Oscalanio on the railway line became the closest canoe route. It was almost as far as going to Rupert House, but it was somewhat better. But the prices were so much cheaper there that, and again, it was certainly, there were official canoe brigades working for the Hudson Bay Company to resupply the Mistissini post. But I think other people either went to Oscalanio and some went to Point Bleu. But Speck was so fortunate that he met people who knew all of the hunting terms. And it might have been just scratches on a piece of paper. He didn't have any, there was no good base maps at the time. The geography of Quebec Labrador was fairly sketchily known. And yet I was able to superimpose my map of what I got, and I didn't, the Hudson territories had been used in the beaver preserve as a way of dividing up land and using officially. And so that there were official maps of these. I didn't use those. I went to every hunter and said, where is your hunting territory? They would show me on a map, and I found it extraordinary that, first of all, there was no disagreements between hunters, one claiming that's part of my land, one. In fact, an incident took place in the bush where some of us went off from the main camp to do some beaver trapping on what we were aware of was close to the edge of our territory. And when we got there, we found the beavers had already been trapped, and we assumed that it was the neighbor. But what that taught me was not so much that people are insistent on boundary lines and what's yours is on this side is yours and what's on that side is mine. They stayed away from those areas. They were focused on the central part. Every year in Nitchican, they had to move. They couldn't return to the same part of their territory. But if they returned after 10 years or so, they would know the animals, there'd be enough animals to kill again, particularly the sedentary animals. The way the hunting territory works, it's particularly well adapted to sedentary animals, which means beaver, which means bear, which means moose to some degree. Moose are quite quiet, and certainly during the winter, they stay in one yarding, the yard in that area where you have high snowfall. So the hunting territory makes a lot of ecological sense in giving the Cree ability to manage a particular area that they know well, even though they may not return there year after year. They build up that knowledge and that sort of thing. But anyway, it taught me that incident of going to the edge of our territory and being disappointed taught both them and me a lesson that the boundary, you don't try to trap right up to your boundaries. You stay away from the boundaries. But which is an opposite way of looking at land tenure from a real estate Western real estate perspective. So anyway, the court case got underway. I was by then partly in Toronto, teaching at Scarborough College, my first experience teaching on my own, but testified in the court case, and found that our lawyers were only, this is Jim O'Reilly, were only interested in us testifying how much economic benefit they got from hunting, and how important hunting was for the economy of the thing. But I made some chance remarks during my testimony, and the judge turned to me and wanted to know more about the spiritual importance of land. That really didn't become a part of the court case, but I was interested that the judge took the time to ask me a bit about that. I didn't go on at great length as I could well have done, because it wasn't the focus. You have to remember, at the time of the court case, it was not clear what the indigenous land title was, whether they had, and so they didn't fight the case on indigenous rights to indigenous, Aboriginal title, whether it continued to exist or had been disappeared simply by white occupation. The focus was on the damage, the economic damage that the James Bay Project would do to the economy of the people. And unfortunately, at the Supreme Court, this was overturned simply on the argument that the James Bay Project would suffer more in the cost to the James Bay Project of canceling the project would be more than it was to the Crees to give up some of their land that would be lost to flooding and other environmental effects. So it was disappointing, and I don't know if it could have gone to the Supreme Court, but anyway, the Cree lawyers turned to the out-of-court settlement. There was what looked on paper, an agreement in principle that looked on paper fairly generous, particularly. See, we had no models to go on of land claims at the time. The last land claims had been numbered treaties, last of which was signed back in the 1920s, and in any case were the most egregious, cheats. The people were not given anywhere close to anything reasonable in terms of remuneration for giving up their land. So, anyway, all of this is going on. The court case is being held, and meanwhile, I'm looking for a job. And at Toronto, Robert Payne, an anthropologist from Montreal, shows up. He was coming really to recruit. In those days, people got recruited. You imagine that? He recruited Gordon Ingalls to come to Montreal, and particularly Montreal had to recruit in those days. It was not it was an expanding anthropology department, but it wasn't one of the well-known prestigious universities. Anyway, I went to lunch with them, and next thing I know, I'm being invited to come to St. John's for a job interview. And at that interview, I met more of Robert Payne and some of the other colleagues, Jean Briggs in particular. Felt I liked the department. It was the closest. I'd spent a lot of time up north by then and really liked the north and access to the environment, to the bush. And St. John's is very, particularly then, it was a very small town, and I just felt very comfortable there as a small university where I would access to a city, but also to the outside, to the thing, and that proved. I've never regretted that decision of taking that job. There was interesting work going on there. The Institute of Social and Economic Research were bringing in people, particularly from Scandinavia, several Scandinavian anthropologists who had a new insight, new views on Canadian Aboriginal issues. In '73, Marguerite Mackenzie was doing linguistic research in the bush. She stayed for most of the year in the camp of the father of Alfred of the Kunkums, Alfred Kunkam, the father of the Grand Chief, and they were obviously a family that had a rough period of alcohol. You know, when I was saying earlier that I found the Cree, in contrast, say, to my experience in the Yukon, as still being very, very much a traditional hunting way of life. But still, there were signs of problems emerging. People, in the summertime when everybody got together, it was in the settlement, there was an enormous amount of drinking going on. I was hauled out of my bed at 3 a.m. to join a party. I went to Chibougamau I used to drive, I had a little truck and would drive people to and there was endless drinking and a lot of racism also in Chibougamau, which annoyed me. One bar, no Indians, right over the door. So it wasn't, the cracks were showing that this way of life that I was studying was not everything, and also even the Pentecostal church was starting to be active there, and they were preaching against traditional spiritual beliefs, and particularly the shaking tent, which by reputation was still going on. There had been one performance while I was there one summer, but I didn't get to see it. I happened to be visiting a camp at the time. But anyway, a lot of the traditional beliefs that I document in bringing home animals, the scapulomancy, the drumming, the singing songs to the spirits and whatever, and they really didn't know half of what was going on. If they'd known all of the things, that would have been. But I went with a few Crees who were interested in this new church. They tried to set up a huge tent in Mistissini, but were kicked out by the chief. It was more or less an Anglican community at that time. And the rumor that got around is, these people are baptizing you. If you get baptized a second time, you'll have two spirits. They won't both be able to go to heaven. So anyway, that was one account I got of why the Pentecostals. But the Pentecostals eventually did establish themselves in Mistissini over the following years. But at that time, we had to go to either Chibougamau or to Chapet, where they were, so people were interested. People, friends of mine who were very, in some ways, traditional Crees, were toying with these other ideas, including Willie Jimmican, my own fictive father. By the time the James Bay Project was being negotiated in 1975, he had an eye operation, a cataract operation in Montreal. He came down. By then, he was a dyed-in-the-wool Pentecostal, we took him to local Pentecostal churches in Montreal where he wanted to stand up and sing. And when everybody told him, no, you do that downstairs. This is a middle class Pentecostal church. You can't do that. You know, he was embarrassing people. So, you know, it was a time of change, but, you know, the negotiation period, you know, I'm at MUN by then, but spending my summers, I began in a couple of years of projects working with archaeologists who are doing salvage research in those areas to be flooded by the hydro dams, particularly LG2 was to be the first dam to be flooded. So I did some research in Fort George, or as it was then, this is before the move, and in Greywell River, people in that general neighborhood who'd hunted and trapped in those areas about to be flooded, and did some historical research with them, as well as acting as a sort of go-between with the archaeologists who would find the Inuit, the Crees, the Cree hunters who knew the area would point out places where you might have a camp to look out for caribou. So they'd go search. They both helped the archaeology search for sites. They knew where people were buried. A lot of people were buried who died in the bush. And then once sites were found, they would help the archaeologists figure out what season, what probably was being hunted from that camp. So that was very interesting. And during that period, I came across one incident of this hostility towards anthropology. I was in Fort George and talked to an old lady who started to tell me about what I've since called a ceremonial hide, about a ceremony where you take the whitest, most clean caribou hide you have and wait until, in the early morning on a cloudless day, wait till the period when the sun is just about to break the horizon, and you expose this this hide to the sun just for the period it takes to break the horizon to where it starts to lift above the horizon. And you have to, this is on Fort George Island, so you're looking out to the east. It was flat, and you know, you had a nice clean horizon to see. And then the hide is brought inside and painted, but just around the edges, painted with different colors. I'd not seen much about this in the literature. It was quite an honor to have been this, because I talked to her and she'd figured out I was seriously interested. But it turned out she had never shown this to any of her own children. And one of her sons found out about it and got very angry with me, thought I was going to write a movie, you know, write a book about this and make lots of money. You know, it was that kind of misunderstanding. I mean, it wasn't a serious situation, but yes, it was that period when elderly people had knowledge that they couldn't really pass on. Things were starting to break down. I don't think this ceremonial hide. The reason why we don't see our copies of it in museums is that after a while they told me they would cut the edge off, the painted edge, and use the hide for moccasins or whatever. And this ball of hide would be kept in a sacred place above the doorway, but was otherwise not brought out and displayed. So a lot of younger people would not know about these things. Okay.